The blockade of Qatar is 9 months old, but the countries behind it, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain and Egypt, have been conspiring against Doha for more than 20 years. The anti-Qatar quartet wanted regime change in 1996 when it attempted a coup, and it wants it now. Why? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hashim Ahalbara. When the blockade against Qatar began in June last year, the question on everyone's lips was why? A new Al Jazeera investigation suggests the answer doesn't lie in events of 9 months ago, but those of more than 2 decades ago. The report reveals new evidence of an attempt by Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Egypt and Bahrain to overthrow the Qatari government in 1996. It includes interviews with coup leaders who conspired to remove the Emir of Qatar at the time, Sheikh Hamad bin Khalifa Thani. He's the father of the current Emir. The investigation implicates leaders from all 4 blockading countries. It says the committee formed to organize the 1996 coup was led by Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, then Chief of Staff of the UAE Armed Forces and the current Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi. Sheikh Hamad bin Isa Al Khalifa, who was then Crown Prince of Bahrain, he is now the country's king. The late Prince Sultan bin Abdulaziz, then Saudi Minister of Defense, who went on to be Crown Prince. And Omar Suleiman, the Egyptian intelligence chief and former Vice President of Egypt, also now deceased. Let's now go to our guests. Joining me here in the studio, Abdulaziz Al Hur, Qatari academic and researcher. In London, Andreas Craig, Assistant Professor at the Defence Studies Department at King's College, London. And from Milan, via Skype, Claude Salhani, Opinion Editor of the Arab Weekly newspaper. Welcome to the programme. Mr. Abdulaziz, I would like to ask you this question. I mean, the investigation on Al Jazeera shows that this is a replay of an old scenario.
Yes, I mean, the 2 episodes clearly shows it's not about terrorism, because, I mean, it's only till late the 90s and early 2000 when we started to hear about the terrorism terminology. It's not about Al Jazeera, because Al Jazeera was established November 1996. It's not about, I mean, supporting Muslim Brotherhood or Islamic, because there was no such support at that time. It's clearly about the sovereignty of this country. It's clearly about the resources and wealth of this country. It's clearly about the geopolitics map of the region. It's clearly about, I mean, distracting the people of these countries to achieve an internal agendas.
So, Craig, I mean, we're talking about in 1996 and in June last year, the same key players who have been the driving force behind a political crisis against Qatar. Quite interesting, though.
Well, you forgot to mention 2014 as well, and we probably should even go back to the 1980s. What we see here is the same kind of people conspiring and coming together and having a problem with the way Qatar is going. And it's really not just Qatar in general. I think it was a problem to start with Hamad bin Khalifa, the father Emir, and now his son, and the policies that would reform not only Qatar, but in many ways, you know, with the introduction of Al Jazeera later on, would also reform the wider Gulf and the Middle East. You know, it had a massive impact on the Arab world. And I think they were both, I mean, Sheikh Hamoza and also Sheikh Hamad were very much reformists in many different ways. They are approaching and propagating liberal values, you know, civil liberties and pluralist governance. It was about liberal education. in many ways, it was kind of disrupting the flow of where the Gulf was going, and it was undermining the hegemony of Saudi Arabia and the leadership of Saudi Arabia in this part of the world. So I think for the Saudis, it was definitely about silencing a country that could become increasingly antagonistic in terms of its ideology and foreign and security policy. For the Emirates, it was more about silencing a competitor because it's another small state in the region, and the Bahrainis the same. I mean, it was as much about interest, I think, as it was also about ideology here.
Mr. Thani, the past sometimes helps us shedding more light onto the present. When you look at the events, 1996 and the attempted coup, 4 key players: Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Egypt. 2017, same thing, same key players. What is the thread that binds together the 2 events that took place during 2 different times?
Well, I think it's a continuation of the beginning, and I think your guest who was just on before me hit the nail on the head. I think it was a question of Qatar bringing new ideas to the region that the Saudis, in their conservatism, did not appreciate. The Bahrain went along with Saudi Arabia, and the Emirates, for a reason, as your guest said, commercial reasons, trying to get in on the action of some of the natural gas that Qatar has. I think Al Jazeera also played a big role in that, because I am convinced that they wanted to see Al Jazeera shut down because of the novelty of the idea of having a channel that could say anything it wanted to a certain extent. And they didn't like that. And there's amongst the 13 points that are still on the agenda, on the list of demands that Qatar should do, figures Al Jazeera. As far as I'm concerned, I've written about this in the past, that Al Jazeera has brought tremendous change in the way media operates in the region. And it's not to everybody's pleasure.
Mr. Al-Har, on the program that was aired by Al Jazeera, one of the key players in the 1996 attempted coup, who was a former senior intelligence officer in Qatar, said that he met with the Bahraini crown prince, who is now the king, Hamad bin Isa Al Khalifa, and he encouraged him and he financed him to carry out acts of sabotage inside Qatar. Was he the key player or the driving force behind the 1996 attempted coup?
I have the belief that in all the previous events, including this event or this crisis, Bahrain is only the interface of the whole crisis. I don't think Bahrain is a key player in the whole crisis, 2014 or 1996 or even the 2017. They don't have the depth, they don't have the strategic position, they don't have the resources, they don't have the really leverage to, play such a role. I think UAE and Saudi Arabia, although they have different agendas, but they share, a common interest here. Then it comes the Egypt.
Andreas, if this is a replication of an old scenario, but then the question that one should ask is basically the key players in 1996, most of them are no longer here. So why should this be replicated a year ago? What has changed and what hasn't?
Actually, from a Saudi and Emirati point of view, things have actually worsened after the Arab Spring. And that brings us back to 2014. I do think that while Qatar was a nuisance in the 90s and, it had a lot of wealth, by, the 20 years on in 2014, Qatar was ridiculously wealthy. Nobody had anticipated such a hyper development. It was a country that was very much punching above its weight, also with Al Jazeera. It was a country that had influence, soft power influence across the world, but particularly also across the Arab world. It was able to influence outcomes of conflicts in the Arab Spring, promoting the people that were protesting against these repressive regimes, which was something that, especially I think here the key player is the UAE and Mohammed bin Zayed, who himself is paranoid, and the UAE are a paranoid country that is afraid of any form of dissidence. And you have here the neighbor, Qatar, is directly engaging with dissidents who are trying to topple the regimes. So by 2014, the problems that they might have had in the 1990s were way exacerbated because Qatar was actually more influential than they had anticipated. And it was undermining the very security narrative that the Saudis and especially the Emiratis were trying to propagate. The Emiratis and the Saudis want a narrative of authoritarian stability in the region, and Qatar is holding against it. They're saying it's not about authoritarian stability, it is about actually empowering the people and creating more pluralist regimes, not necessarily democratic, but those who are more catering to the needs of people. And that is very much something that Mohammed bin Zayed, the Crown Prince of the Emirates, is very much afraid of.
Claude, I mean, we've seen spats between neighbors in different parts of the world. Some of these spats would be contained ultimately when maturity prevails. Do you think that this is something that could potentially be contained, or it just might drag on forever?
Well, I think it has to be contained, and because the countries in the region have no choice but to get along. I mean, it's too destructive if they continue on the track that they are for Qatar and for the other countries. They have to, at one point, come to the realization that they need to negotiate, they need to sit down and work it out. When and how they will do this remains to be seen. And I think one of the reasons that has brought them to separate ways like that is the Syrian civil war, which they disagreed upon in many ways. And from the beginning, they seemed to agree, but then as the war progressed, they divided on how to approach the conflict and who to support and who not to support. So I think first we have to solve the war in Syria and then address secondary issues in the region, and it's not going to be easy.
As we've mentioned, the blockade on Qatar is still ongoing. It began last June when Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Egypt and Bahrain imposed an air, sea and land embargo on Qatar, closing their borders. They accuse Qatar of supporting terrorism, which Doha denies. Kuwait has been trying to mediate the crisis with little success. It recently began a renewed push for talks with the support of the European Union. And US President Donald Trump is scheduled to meet leaders from the UAE, Saudi Arabia and Qatar over the next 2 months. He hopes to help organize a GCC summit to resolve the diplomatic crisis. Mr. Al-Hur, many people believe that there's absolutely no indication to suggest that today or tomorrow this crisis would be resolved because of the rising rhetoric and escalation that we've seen over the last few days.
Exactly, actually, from the escalation or the level of escalation, and with the all the acts they have done, it's basically an act of war against Qatar, socially, culturally, financially, politically. I mean, media, from every front, the way they managed and they are behaving, it does not show that they are willing to really end it very soon, unless there is an external force and external push for these countries to come to the table and put all their all their concerns on the table and transparently discussing, negotiating, and really settling down all these concerns. This will not end. If it's left to their internal will, I think this will drag for a long, long time.
So, Craig, I mean, everyone now believes that the Americans will ultimately have to step in and try to solve this. Do the Americans still have leverage?
Yeah, that is the big question. I mean, the Qataris are betting on two things. They're betting on the mediation of the Kuwaiti Emir, who's done a great job, but unfortunately has been disrespected very much by the Saudis and the Emiratis, who have not taken his voice. They haven't accepted his invitation to the GCC summit last year. And then the other bet is basically Donald Trump, who seemed to have suggested to the Qataris that he will step up during that strategic dialogue between the United States and Qatar, that he will step up and bring all the GCC countries together. And he will now individually meet with Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, after that with Mohammed bin Zayed of the UAE. And then lastly, in May, I believe that the Qatari Emir will also come to Washington, and they will try to discuss any potential ways out. I do think, though, that we're not in the 1980s and not even in the 1990s anymore. I think there's this more of an egalitarian relationship between the United States and the Gulf countries. And it's hard to see to what extent the United States actually still have leverage to pressure someone like Saudi Arabia or the UAE into a certain policy if they're not willing to do so. I think it is quite contrary. I think if you see the narratives coming out of Saudi Arabia and the UAE, they suggest that they're not willing to compromise, they're not willing to make any concessions, and they can live with the status quo. That's also something very important. And I think they will invest massively to change the Donald Trump's mind and tell him we're not willing to negotiate. And a Camp David agreement will only come into place if Donald Trump has any indication that the three will come to an agreement. Otherwise, there will be no agreement.
I see your point.
Or no summit.
Mr. Salhani, now, if the Americans are eager to have this meeting happen at Camp David, and then against the backdrop of the articles which you must have read, particularly from the Washington Post and the New York Times, about the inner circle of the Trump administration, some of its members were plotting against Qatar, some of them were siding with the UAE. Is it still possible for the American administration to set aside those differences from within the inner circle and move forward?
Well, let me take my journalist hat off for a minute and put on my conflict resolutionist hat on. And the sort of the 101 conflict resolution tells you that it's impossible to negotiate a compromise between parties unless both parties consent to the negotiations. So to get to the negotiating table, you have to have an agreement from both sides that it's time to sit down and talk. No pressure from the United States or anywhere else is going to make them change their mind to the point that they will agree to something that will resolve the conflict altogether. Now, putting my journalist hat back on, will the Trump administration be able to do something? I doubt it very much. I think they are caught in the middle of all sorts of internal disputes here and all sorts of scandals and they need to have someone who knows the issues, who can direct it, drive it, and I don't think that's Donald Trump.
Abdul Aziz, Mr. Salhani spoke about the point, which is basically if you want to have a deal, you have to have people sitting around the same table negotiating the compromise. In the past, there was this list of 13 demands.
Yes.
We haven't heard back from the 4 blockading countries about whether they are willing to maintain the 13 demands as a prerequisite for any deal, or they're willing to go for a compromise.
Therefore, I think they are putting these demands and making them really a very complicated demands, very difficult, very, very, very challenging demands, because they don't want to talk, because they don't want to compromise, because they don't want to come to the table. These preconditions are a real obstacle in the way of the negotiation and discussion. From day one, Qatar has showed the interest to go for a dialogue, but two-way dialogue, not one-way dialogue. Not first you consent, you admit, you approve the 13th points, then we come to the table. Then you come to the table to say what? Therefore, any kind of dialogue, it has to be a dialogue. It has to be from both direction with a neutral mediator like Kuwait. I think United States is benefiting from this dispute, actually.
In which way?
From both sides, working individually with both sides. Now you see more of arm deals, you see more of commercial
Not only the Americans,
deals.
the Europeans.
Everybody is benefiting from this. It's not of the high interest for America to rush the settlement of this dispute or the crisis. They know, when exactly to interfere and to make this pressure for them to come together.
Mr. Craig, the axiom in international politics is basically when you have a spat, the two sides come together. For them to break the impasse, they have to make concessions. Do you see in the near future Qataris making concessions and the blockading countries making concessions?
I think, as Mr. Al-Khor said, I think it's the same dispute that goes back decades, and they come up with new narratives, the narrative of terrorism, then the narrative about Iran, in order to accuse Qatar of something. I don't think it was ever about allowing Qatar to actually meet these demands and ever make any concessions, because there's nothing Qatar can do. If you look at Qatar in 2018, Qatar has complied with all the demands that were made. Qatar is very open. It's the most open. It's a master student, if you will, in terms of opening up their books to the United States. It's quite clear that everybody has a vision and a look into the books of Qatar in terms of what Qatar is doing with its finances. It's an open policy in terms of reforming labor law. I mean, the countries are trying to address all these allegations, and they have done so. So none of the allegations stick, and they are not substantiated. So there's nothing more Qatar can do. I do agree with Al-Khor as well. I think that the Americans are everybody's benefiting. The Europeans are benefiting of this spat because there are deals being made. Billions of dollars are being paid by the UAE, Saudi, and the Qataris in weapon systems, for example.
Mr. Salhani, these countries share many things in common. There are tribal affiliations. They're part of the Arab League. They're part of the GCC. Yet they can't set aside their differences. Where do you see the region if the crisis continues?
Well, as I said earlier, they have no choice but to put aside their differences and get together, or else you're going to have many states, as sort of Italy was in the 1600s, with city-states fighting each other, which is ridiculous. I mean, you said it, they're tribal, they're part of the Arab League, they're part of the GCC. They have so much in common, yet they find routes to dispute. And the only ones benefiting are the Europeans and the Americans in selling weapons. Billions of dollars are being made by the French and by the Americans, selling guns to Abu Dhabi, to Saudi Arabia. And they have to look beyond that and realize that they have no options other than to get along.
Okay. Trying to look beyond that, Mr. Al-Khor. After the crisis, right after the crisis, we saw signs of new political or regional realignments. The Turks stepped in, they're playing quite a significant role. Iran itself. If the crisis continues, are we likely to see some sort of stronger alliance between Qatar and Iran, for example?
I would say different alliances in the region. You know, I mean, before, with all these commonalities among the GCC, there were always tensions, but we had leaders who were able to talk about them, to contain them, to, I mean, put them aside and focus on the common interests, and you can serve your own interests as well. But what is happening today, this ambitious, this hunger for the positioning and repositioning made these countries very jealous of what Qatar has really achieved politically, media-wise, economy-wise, financial-wise. I mean, therefore, I think part of it is very personal. Does not rely on logic or a real interest or deep analysis. Therefore, what I see, it's a continuation of this crisis unless these countries really think about the future, not for them, for even their generations. As the Minister of Qatar has said, we lose a dollar, they lose a dollar.
Absolutely.
I say we bleed, they bleed. I mean, nobody is winning in this whole crisis.
I see your point. Mr. Correct, very briefly. Two institutions were supposed to referee the spat, the Arab League, GCC, seen by many as the most inefficient in the world. In their absence, do you see the GCC disintegrating in the near future?
I think we're seeing the GCC being relegated to the same fate as the Arab League. It's a talking shop where nobody is consistent anymore, where people don't participate, and people go their separate ways. And I think the Saudi-UAE alliance that we see now is the end of the GCC. They will create their own alliance. And I think the rift that is going through the Gulf and the Arab world is between the revolutionaries and the counter-revolutionaries. And this will continue, and that's something that will divide the GCC for the years to come.
Andreas Gregg, Claude Salhani, Abdulaziz Al-Khor, thank you very much indeed for your contribution to the program. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashim Ahlbar, and the whole team here. Bye for now.